She stood in the center of the interrogation room, wrists bound behind the metal chair. The first hammer struck her shoulder with enough force to shatter concrete. The steel head cracked clean in half. The second hammer met her ribs, and the wooden handle splintered like kindling. By the fourth broken tool, the room had gone completely silent. Because Sarah Chen wasn't just another prisoner. She was something the Bureau had never encountered before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday at the Federal Bureau of Anomalous Research Facility in Quantico. Coffee brewing in the break room, security guards making their rounds, and Dr. Marcus Webb reviewing overnight incident reports with the methodical precision that had earned him his position as Director of Containment Operations. Webb's office overlooked Sublevel 3, where the most dangerous subjects were housed behind 6 inches of reinforced titanium and electromagnetic dampening fields. In his 15 years running the facility, he'd seen things that would make seasoned FBI agents resign on the spot. Humans who could bend steel with their minds. Others who could phase through solid matter. Individuals whose very presence warped reality around them. But nothing had prepared him for the report sitting on his desk. Dr. Amanda Price knocked twice before entering, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of exhaustion. She'd been the facility's lead researcher for 8 years, overseeing hundreds of anomalous individuals who'd been quietly removed from society for the safety of both themselves and the general population. "The Philadelphia incident," she said without preamble, setting a thick folder on Webb's desk. "We have confirmation." Webb opened the file and immediately understood why Price looked like she hadn't slept in days. Photographs spilled across his desk, a demolished city block. Twisted metal that had once been armored vehicles. Crater patterns in concrete that suggested explosive impacts, except no explosives had been used. 17 agents, Price continued, her voice flat with professional distance. 4 tactical response vehicles. 2 containment units, rated for CLASS-5 anomalous subjects. All neutralized by a single individual. Webb studied a photograph of what remained of an armored personnel carrier. The vehicle had been folded in half like origami, its steel plating compressed into patterns that defied basic physics. "Casualty report?" "That's the strangest part," Price said, pulling up a chair. "0 fatalities. Every agent and officer involved in the containment attempt was found unconscious, but physically unharmed. Precise application of force that rendered them incapacitated without causing permanent damage." "Anomalous subject profile?" Price hesitated. "Sarah Chen, age 28. Former Army Corps of Engineers, honorably discharged 3 years ago. No criminal record, no history of violent behavior, no known association with any anomalous research programs or terrorist organizations. Until 6 months ago, she was working as a structural engineer for a construction firm in Philadelphia." Webb flipped through the chronological incident reports, each one escalating in severity. What triggered the first manifestation? Construction site accident. A crane malfunction dropped a 2-ton steel beam directly onto her work area. When the rescue team reached her 4 hours later, they found her standing in a crater, completely uninjured, holding the beam above her head. She'd been supporting its full weight for the entire duration of the rescue operation. The photographs told the story in stark detail. Sarah Chen, dust-covered and confused, standing amid twisted wreckage that should have killed her instantly. Her expression wasn't one of triumph or power, but of bewildered terror at her own survival. Initial containment attempts? "Standard protocol," Price said, though her tone suggested nothing about this case had been standard. Local police responded first, assuming she was trapped under debris. When they realized what they were seeing, they called in federal support. First contact team approached with standard non-lethal pacification methods. Webb examined photographs of the first containment attempt. Police cruisers reduced to scrap metal, taser wires snapped like threads. Riot shields crumpled into unusable fragments. And in the center of it all, Sarah Chen looked horrified at the destruction surrounding her. "She wasn't fighting back," Price explained. "Every indication suggests she was trying to surrender, to cooperate. But any physical contact with containment equipment resulted in immediate equipment failure. not through any visible force or energy projection, but through what can only be described as absolute physical resistance. Quote, define resistance. Price pulled out a technical analysis report. When struck by a police baton, the baton shattered. When restraints were applied, the handcuffs snapped. When a containment team attempted to subdue her with riot control measures, their equipment disintegrated on contact. It's as if her body has become impervious to external force. Webb studied video stills from the initial containment attempts. Sarah Chen stood with her hands raised in surrender, tears streaming down her face, while around her, trained professionals struggled with equipment that simply stopped functioning in her presence. Escalation timeline? 14 separate containment attempts over 6 months, Price said, her exhaustion becoming more apparent. Each one is more sophisticated than the last. Local police, state response teams, federal tactical units, finally, our own specialized containment protocols. Every single attempt resulted in complete equipment failure and Sarah Chen remaining at large. The documentation painted a picture of mounting frustration and desperation. Incident reports grew increasingly frantic as standard protocols failed spectacularly. Containment foam that couldn't harden around her, electromagnetic restraints that shorted out on contact, sedative darts that bent and broke against her skin without penetrating. Property damage assessment? Price handed him another folder, this one even thicker. $47 million in destroyed federal equipment. 12 city blocks require structural assessment and repair. 63 injured personnel, though again, no fatalities. It's as if she's physically incapable of causing lethal harm, even when defending herself. Webb reviewed photographs of the progression. Early incidents showed minimal collateral damage, but as containment efforts escalated, so did the destruction. Not from malicious intent, but from the simple physics of immovable objects meeting unstoppable forces. When Sarah Chen couldn't be moved, everything that tried to move her broke instead. Psychological profile? That's where this gets complicated, Price said, pulling out audio transcripts. We managed to establish communication during the 7th containment attempt. Agent Rodriguez spent 3 hours talking with her from a safe distance before his team's equipment failed. Webb read through the transcript, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Sarah Chen's words painted a picture of a terrified woman who didn't understand what was happening to her, who desperately wanted to cooperate with authorities, who was horrified by the destruction that followed her wherever she went. I never wanted any of this, one transcript read. I just want to go home. I want to see my family. Every time someone tries to help me, their equipment breaks. Every time I try to explain, something gets destroyed. I can't control it. Has she attempted to flee the area? That's perhaps the most telling detail, Price said. Multiple opportunities to escape the city, but she's remained within a 6-block radius of her original apartment. She's been sleeping in abandoned buildings, avoiding populated areas, apparently trying to minimize contact with civilians. Webb studied a map marked with Sarah Chen's movements over the past 6 months. The pattern was clear. Someone trying to stay put, not someone running from authority. Someone waiting to be helped, not someone evading capture. Latest incident report? Price's expression darkened. Yesterday morning, full tactical response. Containment Unit Alpha, with specialized anomalous suppression equipment, electromagnetic pulse generators, kinetic dampeners, even experimental gravitational field manipulators borrowed from the Nevada facility. The photographs from the latest attempt showed devastation on an unprecedented scale, military-grade equipment reduced to twisted metal and electronic components. Vehicles that had been engineered to contain reality-warping anomalies now looked like abstract art installations. Duration of engagement? 18 minutes, Price said, 17 of which were spent by Sarah Chen attempting to communicate with the team leader, begging them to stop the attack. The 18th minute was when she apparently decided that surrender wasn't possible and needed to protect herself. Webb examined the final photographs. A perfect circle of destruction centered on Sarah Chen's position, with damage radiating outward in precise patterns. Buildings within the blast radius showed structural damage, but again, no human casualties. Every person in the area had been found unconscious but unharmed. Current status? She's barricaded herself in the basement of a condemned office building on Broad Street. Building's been evacuated, surrounding blocks cleared of civilians. She's been there for 36 hours, and we've had no communication since the incident. Webb closed the files and stood, walking to his window overlooking the containment levels. Dozens of anomalous individuals lived in relative comfort below, their abilities contained through a combination of advanced technology and voluntary cooperation. Each had been brought in through methods that balanced public safety with human dignity. Recommendations? Price joined him at the window. Director, I've been doing this for 8 years. I've contained reality benders, time manipulators, individuals who could level city blocks with a thought. But I've never encountered anyone who seemed so fundamentally opposed to causing harm while being simultaneously impossible to contain through conventional means. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Are you suggesting we abandon containment protocols? I'm suggesting that our protocols may be fundamentally flawed for this case, Price said carefully. Every attempt to use force has resulted in escalation. Every piece of equipment we've deployed has been neutralized. And through it all, Sarah Chen has shown remarkable restraint in not using her abilities offensively. Webb reviewed the incident timelines again. 6 months of escalating containment attempts, millions in damages, dozens of injured personnel, and yet not a single death. Either Sarah Chen was remarkably lucky, or she possessed a level of control that made her far more dangerous than their assessments indicated. What's your professional opinion on her threat level? Price was quiet for a long moment. As long as we continue trying to contain her through force, she represents an existential threat to any personnel or equipment deployed against her. But based on her behavioral patterns and the precise nature of her defensive responses, I believe she may be the least malicious anomalous subject we've ever encountered. Least malicious, but most destructive. Only when cornered, Price corrected. Every escalation has been in direct response to containment attempts. When left alone, she causes no damage, threatens no one, and actively avoids civilian contact. Webb studied the containment facility below, wondering if they had the resources to house someone who could apparently destroy anything that tried to restrain her. Standard containment cells were designed for subjects who could be physically controlled. Electromagnetic fields, reinforced barriers, chemical sedation. None of those options seemed viable for Sarah Chen. Facility modifications required? Unknown, Price admitted. We don't understand the mechanism behind her abilities. Is it enhanced physical resistance, reality manipulation, some form of kinetic absorption and redirection? Until we understand what we're dealing with, designing containment measures is essentially impossible. And she's been alone in that building for 36 hours. No food, no water, no medical attention. Building structurally compromised from the recent incident, and winter temperatures are dropping below freezing at night. Quote, Webb made a decision that would either solve their most challenging containment case or create an unprecedented crisis. I want a direct communication attempt. No equipment, no backup teams, no containment protocols. Someone goes in and talks to her. Price looked startled. Director, after what happened to the last team? The last team went in armed with experimental weapons and electromagnetic restraints. Webb cut her off. I'm talking about one person, unarmed, with nothing but communication equipment and good intentions. Who would volunteer for that? Webb was already walking toward his secure phone. Someone who understands that sometimes the most dangerous approach is the one that looks the safest, and sometimes the safest approach is the one that looks the most dangerous. As he dialed, Webb looked back at the photographs scattered across his desk. Sarah Chen's face in each one, showing not the cold calculation of a dangerous anomaly, but the terrified confusion of someone who'd become something she didn't understand and couldn't control. The phone rang twice before being answered. This is Director Webb at Quantico. I need someone who specializes in impossible cases. 3 hours later, Dr. Rebecca Thompson walked through the lobby of the Federal Bureau of Anomalous Research like she owned the place, which was ironic considering she'd been banned from federal facilities for the past 2 years. Her sneakers squeaked against polished marble floors that reflected the imposing seal of the Bureau. Security guards in crisp uniforms watched her approach with the kind of suspicious attention usually reserved for protesters and journalists. She looked nothing like what anyone expected from someone summoned to solve the Bureau's most challenging case. Faded jeans with paint stains on the knees. An oversized flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Wild auburn hair that hadn't seen a brush in recent memory, held back with what appeared to be a rubber band salvaged from a newspaper. She carried a battered canvas messenger bag that looked like it had survived several natural disasters, and a coffee cup from a gas station in rural Montana. At the security checkpoint, Thompson placed her bag on the conveyor belt with the casual confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. The X-ray operator frowned at his screen, then looked up at her with confusion. "Ma'am, is this some kind of medical device?" He pointed to an image showing what appeared to be a collection of metal objects nestled among notebooks and candy bar wrappers. "Tuning forks," Thompson replied, taking a sip of gas station coffee that was probably older than some of the security guards. "Different frequencies. You'd be surprised how often they come in handy." The guard looked to his supervisor, who shrugged and waved Thompson through. As she collected her bag, she noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere that always accompanied her arrival at official facilities. Conversations quieted. People found reasons to look busy. The air itself seemed to develop a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Dr. Webb was waiting by the elevators, and his expression immediately shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed skepticism. He'd been expecting someone with credentials, someone who looked like they belonged in federal briefing rooms discussing classified anomalies. Instead, he got someone who looked like she'd wandered in from a folk music festival. "Dr. Thompson?" He extended his hand with the mechanical politeness of someone going through required motions. "Rebecca's fine," she said, shaking his hand with calloused fingers that felt like they'd been handling tools and equipment for years. Though I should mention the doctorate is in theoretical physics, not psychology or anomalous studies. Webb's frown deepened. "Your file indicated expertise in containment-resistant subjects." "My file probably indicates a lot of things," Thompson replied, following him into an elevator that required special clearance to access the lower levels. Most of them were written by people who were trying to discredit me after the Nevada incident. The Nevada incident that resulted in 3 researchers being hospitalized and a complete shutdown of the dimensional research program. Thompson's expression didn't change. The Nevada incident that prevented a dimensional breach that would have made Chernobyl look like a kitchen fire. But I understand why the official reports focused on the property damage rather than the prevented catastrophe. The elevator descended past floors that didn't exist on any public building plans. Webb studied Thompson's reflection in the polished steel doors, trying to reconcile her appearance with the classified file he'd reviewed that morning. Academic publications in quantum mechanics. Consulting work for CERN. 3 separate commendations from international physics organizations for theoretical breakthroughs in dimensional stability. And then the black marks. Unauthorized experiments. Conflicts with department heads. The infamous confrontation with the director of the Nevada facility that had ended with her security clearance revoked and her name placed on a federal watch list. "Dr. Price briefed me on your unconventional approaches," Webb said carefully. "Amanda called me?" Thompson seemed genuinely surprised. "I figured she'd still be angry about the Prague conference." "The Prague conference where you demonstrated spontaneous dimensional folding using equipment built from hardware store components." "The Prague conference where I proved that half the anomalous research community was overthinking problems that had elegant solutions if you stopped trying to apply conventional logic to unconventional phenomena." Thompson adjusted her messenger bag as the elevator continued its descent. "But again, I understand why the academic community focused on the part where I made their $1 million equipment look obsolete." The elevator opened onto sublevel 3, revealing a corridor lined with containment cells behind transparent aluminum barriers. Each cell was occupied by individuals whose abilities had been deemed too dangerous for general society. A man who could manipulate gravity sat reading a newspaper while small objects orbited around his chair. A woman whose presence caused electronic devices to evolve was working on what appeared to be a laptop that had grown additional screens and processing units. Thompson walked down the corridor with the casual interest of someone touring a museum, occasionally stopping to observe the contained anomalies with genuine curiosity rather than fear or revulsion. She paused at one cell, where a young man was creating complex mathematical equations in mid-air, using nothing but focused thought. "Fascinating," she murmured, pulling a notebook from her bag and sketching the geometric patterns. "Spatial mathematics with real-time dimensional verification. No wonder traditional containment works for him. He's essentially containing himself by creating stable mathematical frameworks." Webb watched her scribble notes with growing confusion. Most researchers approached anomalous subjects with clinical detachment or barely controlled fear. Thompson looked like she was taking notes at an art gallery. "Your assessment of our containment protocols?" Webb asked. "Adequate for subjects whose abilities operate within conventional physical frameworks," Thompson replied, not looking up from her notebook. "Though I notice you're using electromagnetic dampening fields that are probably causing more stress than necessary. Most anomalous abilities aren't actually violations of physics, just applications of physics that we don't fully understand yet." "And subjects whose abilities violate physics entirely?" Thompson finally looked up from her notes. "Physics isn't violated, Webb, just our understanding of it. Every anomaly I've encountered has operated according to consistent rules. The problem is that most researchers try to apply their existing knowledge, instead of learning the new rules." They reached the briefing room where Dr. Price was waiting with a collection of files, laptops, and what appeared to be enough coffee to keep a small army awake for a week. She looked up as they entered, and her expression immediately shifted from professional exhaustion to something approaching relief. "Rebecca," she said, standing to embrace Thompson like an old friend, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "You said it was impossible," Thompson replied with a slight smile. "You know I can't resist the impossible." Webb cleared his throat, reclaiming attention. "If we could focus on the briefing." "The Sarah Chen case," Thompson interrupted, settling into a chair and pulling out her notebook. 28-year-old former Army engineer, with apparent invulnerability to physical force. 6 months of failed containment attempts, millions in destroyed equipment, and a facility full of frustrated professionals who are probably considering whether their careers might benefit from her accidental death during containment. The silence that followed was heavy enough to require structural support. Webb and Price exchanged glances that confirmed Thompson's assessment was uncomfortably accurate. "That's a rather harsh characterization," Webb said slowly. "But not an inaccurate one," Thompson replied, opening her notebook to a fresh page. "Amanda, show me the progression files." Price activated a large display screen and began cycling through incident reports. Thompson watched with the focused attention of someone reading a complex technical manual, occasionally asking Price to pause on specific photographs or data points. She didn't take notes on the obvious details that other researchers had focused on. Instead, she sketched patterns that seemed unrelated to the containment failures. "Interesting," she murmured after reviewing the 6th incident report. "The equipment damage follows consistent geometric patterns. Not random destruction, but precise application of force along specific stress vectors." "We noticed that too," Webb said. "Our analysts believe she's developed some form of enhanced spatial awareness that allows her to identify weak points in containment equipment." Thompson looked up with an expression that suggested Webb had just announced his belief in flat Earth theory. "Webb, look at these damage patterns again." "Really, look at them." She stood and approached the display, using her finger to trace the destruction patterns in each photograph. Equipment failure points follow mathematical curves. Not random stress fractures, but precise engineering calculations applied in real time to minimize collateral damage while neutralizing threats. "Are you suggesting she's deliberately calculating optimal destruction patterns?" "I'm suggesting she's not destroying anything," Thompson said, returning to her chair. "She's solving engineering problems. Every piece of equipment that's failed around her has failed in ways that minimize harm to personnel, while eliminating the equipment's capacity to restrain her." Price leaned forward with interest. "Explain." Thompson pulled out one of her tuning forks and struck it against the table. The clear, pure tone filled the room. When you apply force to any system, the system responds according to its structural limitations. Sarah Chen isn't breaking things. She's revealing their breaking points and applying just enough pressure to reach those points without exceeding them. "That's impossible," Webb said. "The calculations required to perform that kind of real-time structural analysis would require a brain that's been restructured to process spatial relationships in ways we don't understand," Thompson finished. "Which brings us to the real question. What happened to Sarah Chen 6 months ago that changed her from a normal structural engineer into someone who intuitively understands the mathematical relationships governing physical matter?" She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be academic papers. Construction site accident, 2-ton steel beam, 4 hours of supporting the weight manually. Anyone want to guess what kind of neural rewiring might result from 4 hours of consciousness under impossible physical stress? Webb and Price looked at each other with expressions suggesting this line of reasoning hadn't occurred to their previous analysis teams. "You're suggesting her brain adapted to process information differently?" Price asked. "I'm suggesting her brain was forced to develop new processing capabilities in order to survive an impossible situation," Thompson corrected. "And now she's operating with enhanced spatial awareness that makes her essentially incompatible with containment methods designed for normal human limitations." "Even if that's true," Webb interjected, "it doesn't change the fact that she's uncontainable through conventional means." Thompson smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just identified the flaw in a complex equation. "Webb, you've been trying to contain her using conventional means designed for conventional subjects. What makes you think conventional approaches would work on someone who's fundamentally unconventional? What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting you stop trying to force her into a box she doesn't fit and start designing a solution that works with her capabilities instead of against them." Thompson stood and shouldered her messenger bag. "But first I need to meet her." Webb's expression shifted to alarm. "Absolutely not. After what happened to the last contact team?" "The last contact team went in armed with restraint equipment and backup protocols," Thompson interrupted. "I'm talking about walking in with nothing but good intentions and professional curiosity. That's suicide." Thompson was already walking toward the door. "Webb, in my experience, the most dangerous thing you can do when dealing with an anomalous subject is approach them like they're dangerous. Fear creates defensive responses, and defensive responses from someone like Sarah Chen apparently involve extensive property damage. You can't just walk into an active containment zone." Thompson paused at the door and looked back with an expression that mixed amusement with pity. "Watch me." As she left the briefing room, Webb turned to Price with barely controlled frustration. "Please tell me you didn't bring in someone who's going to get herself killed on our watch." Price was staring at the door Thompson had just walked through, her expression thoughtful. "Marcus, I've worked with Rebecca before. She's unconventional, abrasive, and has a tendency to ignore safety protocols. She's also never lost a subject, never had a containment failure, and never met an anomalous individual she couldn't communicate with." "Even subjects who destroy everything they touch?" "Especially subjects who destroy everything they touch," Price replied. "Because Rebecca doesn't approach them like subjects to be contained. She approaches them like people to be understood." Webb looked at the incident reports still displayed on the screen, showing 6 months of escalating failures and mounting property damage. Then he looked at the elevator that Thompson had taken toward the surface, carrying her toward a confrontation with the most containment-resistant subject in Bureau history. "This is either going to solve our problem," he said quietly, "or create a crisis that makes the last 6 months look like a training exercise." Outside, Thompson was already walking through the parking lot toward a battered pickup truck that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and held together with optimism. She drove toward Philadelphia with the radio playing classic rock and a thermos of coffee that was somehow even worse than what she'd had at the gas station. In her rearview mirror, she could see 2 unmarked Bureau vehicles maintaining discreet surveillance distance. Standard protocol for monitoring unauthorized contact with anomalous subjects. She waved at them in her side mirror and continued driving toward what would either be the most successful anomalous contact in Bureau history or the most spectacular failure anyone had ever witnessed. The condemned office building on Broad Street looked like urban decay in architectural form. Windows boarded with plywood, fire escapes hanging at dangerous angles, and a foundation that had been settling unevenly for the better part of a decade. Yellow tape and concrete barriers marked the perimeter where federal agents maintained what they generously called a safe distance from someone who could apparently turn military equipment into abstract art. Rebecca Thompson parked her battered pickup truck outside the perimeter and walked toward the command post that had been hastily erected in the parking lot of a neighboring strip mall. Agent David Martinez looked up from a bank of monitoring equipment with the expression of someone whose day had just gotten significantly more complicated. "Ma'am, this is a restricted zone. You need to—" "Dr. Rebecca Thompson," she interrupted, pulling a worn leather wallet from her back pocket and flashing credentials that Martinez examined with growing confusion. "Bureau consultation authorization from Director Webb." Martinez studied the credentials, then looked at Thompson's appearance, then back at the credentials as if hoping they might transform into something that made more sense. "You're the specialist they called in?" "Disappointed?" Thompson asked, surveying the command post with the critical eye of someone who'd seen this particular type of federal operation before. Banks of electronic monitoring equipment, thermal imaging displays, communication arrays, and enough computing power to launch a space mission. All pointed at a single building where one person was apparently doing nothing more threatening than existing. "Ma'am, we've had 17 containment specialists, 4 psychological assessment teams, and 2 anomalous research units evaluate this situation," Martinez said, following her gaze toward the building. "What makes you think?" "That I can succeed where everyone else failed," Thompson finished. "Maybe I can't, but I can guarantee that I won't fail in exactly the same ways everyone else has." She walked to the edge of the perimeter, studying the building with the intensity of an architect examining blueprints. After several minutes of silence, she pulled out her notebook and began sketching structural details that seemed irrelevant to the tactical situation. "Load-bearing walls compromised by recent explosive damage," she murmured, more to herself than to Martinez. "Foundation stress patterns consistent with repeated kinetic impacts. But the damage is localized, controlled. Someone's been very careful not to bring the whole structure down." Martinez approached cautiously. "Our engineers estimate the building won't survive another major incident. If we attempt containment and she responds defensively, the building comes down, potentially killing her and creating a public relations nightmare that makes the Philadelphia incident look like a parking violation," Thompson said, not looking up from her sketching. "Which is probably why she chose this location, strategic positioning to limit your tactical options." "You think she's manipulating the situation?" Thompson finally looked up from her notebook with an expression that suggested Martinez had missed something obvious. "Martinez, she's a structural engineer. Understanding building integrity and strategic positioning is literally her profession. She didn't choose this building randomly." She pointed to specific details in the structure that Martinez hadn't noticed. Basement level with multiple exit routes, but positioned so that any attempt to breach from multiple directions would compromise the building's stability. Upper floors damaged enough to be obviously unsafe, limiting vertical approach options. And the foundation damage creates acoustic amplification, meaning she can hear anyone approaching from several blocks away. Martinez studied the building with new appreciation for its tactical complexities. "So what do you recommend?" "I recommend that someone who understands structural engineering and anomalous psychology walk in the front door and ask politely if she'd like to talk," Thompson said, shouldering her messenger bag. "That's suicide." Thompson smiled with the confidence of someone who'd heard that assessment before. "Martinez, has anyone actually tried the polite approach?" She walked past the perimeter barriers before Martinez could respond, ignoring the radio chatter that immediately erupted behind her. Through her earpiece, she could hear Webb's voice crackling with static and barely controlled panic. "Thompson, you are not authorized for direct contact. Return to the perimeter immediately." Thompson reached up and switched off her radio, then dropped the earpiece into her pocket. The sudden silence was almost peaceful, after hours of tactical chatter and equipment noise. The building's lobby had been stripped of anything valuable years ago, leaving behind water-stained walls, broken ceiling tiles, and the particular smell of urban abandonment. But as Thompson approached the stairwell leading to the basement, she noticed something that the surveillance teams had missed. Fresh scratch marks on the concrete floor. Not random damage, but precise geometric patterns that formed a complex mathematical equation. Someone had been using the building's surface as a calculation pad, working through engineering problems with the kind of obsessive focus that Thompson recognized from her own research sessions. She photographed the equations with her phone, then pulled out one of her tuning forks and struck it against the concrete wall. The tone echoed through the building with perfect clarity, carrying in all directions with the acoustic efficiency that only occurred in structures designed for optimal sound transmission. From somewhere below, another tone responded. Different frequency, but harmonically related to Thompson's initial note. Someone in the basement was answering her signal with mathematical precision. Thompson struck her tuning fork again, this time choosing a frequency that created a specific harmonic relationship with the response tone. The answer came immediately, a perfect mathematical complement that demonstrated not just musical knowledge, but understanding of acoustic physics and harmonic theory. She began descending the stairs, using her tuning fork to maintain acoustic contact with whoever was below. Each exchange became more complex, evolving from simple harmonic relationships to intricate acoustic equations that required advanced understanding of wave mechanics and frequency modulation. By the time she reached the basement level, Thompson and her unseen correspondent had constructed an elaborate musical conversation that served as both communication and demonstration of shared technical knowledge. It was the kind of exchange that could only occur between people who understood that mathematics and music were essentially the same language expressed through different media. The basement had been converted into what appeared to be a combination workshop and living space. Sleeping bag arranged on a makeshift bed of concrete blocks and salvaged cushions. Canned food organized with military precision. And covering every available wall surface, mathematical equations written in what appeared to be charcoal and chalk. Sarah Chen sat in the center of the room, surrounded by equations that covered three-dimensional space like a mathematical cocoon. She looked exhausted, undernourished, and absolutely terrified, but her eyes showed the sharp intelligence of someone who'd been using her isolation to work through problems that nobody else had been able to solve. "You're not Bureau," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from weeks of limited communication. "Dr. Rebecca Thompson," Thompson replied, setting her messenger bag down slowly and keeping her hands visible. "Theoretical physicist, former dimensional researcher, and someone who's interested in understanding rather than containing." Quote, Sarah studied Thompson's appearance with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. No equipment, no backup team, no restraint protocols. No agenda beyond professional curiosity, Thompson confirmed. And maybe finding a solution that works better than the approaches that have been tried so far. Sarah gestured to the equations covering the walls around her. "I've been working on that problem for 6 months. Thompson approached slowly, studying the mathematical work with genuine fascination. The equations were elegant, complex, and completely unlike anything she'd seen in conventional physics textbooks. They described relationships between force, matter, and consciousness that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. "These calculations," Thompson said, pointing to a particularly complex section, "they're describing consciousness as a measurable force that can influence physical matter at the quantum level. You can read them?" Thompson pulled out her notebook and began sketching portions of Sarah's work. "Quantum consciousness theory. I published papers on similar concepts before my funding was cut and my security clearance revoked." Sarah's expression shifted from suspicion to surprised interest. "The Prague conference papers? You're R.E. Thompson? You've read my work?" "Your research on dimensional stability through consciousness-mediated quantum field manipulation was brilliant," Sarah said, standing for the first time since Thompson's arrival. "The academic community rejected it because they couldn't replicate your results, but the mathematical framework was sound." Thompson felt a familiar surge of vindication that came from meeting someone who understood her theoretical work. They couldn't replicate the results because they approached consciousness as an external observer rather than as an integral component of the quantum system being measured. "Exactly," Sarah gestured to her wall equations with growing excitement. "What happened to me 6 months ago wasn't just physical transformation, it was consciousness integration with quantum field mechanics. My awareness became part of the measurement apparatus for reality around me." Thompson studied the equations with new understanding, which means you're not manipulating matter through force. You're manipulating matter through observation and conscious intention. Quote, "But I can't control it," Sarah said, her excitement fading back into exhaustion. "Every time someone approaches me with hostile intent, my consciousness automatically calculates optimal defensive responses. I don't choose to break their equipment. My awareness simply identifies the most efficient way to neutralize threats while minimizing harm to people." Thompson pulled out her phone and showed Sarah the photograph she'd taken of the lobby equations. "These calculations upstairs. You've been working on control mechanisms." Sarah nodded. "Trying to develop conscious override protocols that would let me choose my responses instead of operating on pure defensive instinct. But mathematics is incredibly complex, and I haven't had access to research materials or collaboration with anyone who understands the theoretical frameworks." Thompson looked around the basement workshop with new appreciation. Sarah Chen hadn't been hiding from the Bureau for 6 months. She'd been conducting independent research into her own condition, working toward a solution that would make peaceful coexistence possible. "Show me what you've discovered," Thompson said, pulling out her notebook and settling cross-legged on the concrete floor. For the next hour, Sarah walked Thompson through 6 months of solitary research into consciousness-mediated quantum mechanics. Her theoretical work was brilliant, innovative, and completely outside the boundaries of conventional physics. She'd developed mathematical models that described how conscious observation could influence quantum field behavior at macroscopic scales. The problem, Sarah explained, pointing to a series of equations that hurt Thompson's brain to contemplate, is that consciousness integration appears to be irreversible. Once awareness becomes part of quantum measurement, separating it from the system causes reality instability. Which means you can't be fixed in any conventional sense, Thompson said, understanding the implications immediately. Right. But I might be able to develop conscious control over the integration. Learn to moderate my influence on quantum fields through meditation and focused attention. Thompson studied Sarah's research with growing excitement. Sarah, what you've discovered here isn't just a solution to your personal situation. It's a fundamental breakthrough in consciousness studies that could revolutionize our understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. Quote, if I can learn to control it without destroying everything around me. Thompson stood and walked to one of the wall equations, pulling out her own pen to add notations and corrections to Sarah's work. What if I told you that you don't need to learn control? What if you need to learn about partnership? I don't understand. Thompson turned back to Sarah with the expression of someone who'd just solved a puzzle that had been frustrating her for years. Your consciousness has integrated with quantum mechanics at a level that most physicists can only theorize about. Instead of trying to suppress that integration, we need to develop it into a conscious collaboration between your awareness and quantum reality. Above them, the sound of heavy vehicles and tactical equipment was growing louder as the Bureau's containment teams prepared for what they assumed would be another failed contact attempt. Thompson looked up at the ceiling with a slight smile. Sarah, how would you feel about demonstrating to some very skeptical federal agents that their approach to this situation has been fundamentally flawed from the beginning? What do you mean? Thompson was already pulling communication equipment from her messenger bag. It's time to show them that the most dangerous, anomalous subject they've ever encountered might actually be the key to solving problems they didn't even know they had. As she activated her radio, Thompson could hear Webb's voice immediately demanding status reports and extraction protocols. She ignored the tactical chatter and spoke directly into the microphone with the calm confidence of someone who just changed the rules of the game. Director Webb, this is Thompson. I'm sending up some mathematical equations that I think you're going to want your research team to examine very carefully, because what you've been trying to contain isn't an anomalous subject. It's the future of consciousness research, and she's been trying to solve the problem for you for the past 6 months. The radio silence that followed was the sound of an entire federal operation, realizing that their fundamental assumptions about the situation had been completely wrong from the beginning. Director Webb stared at the photographs Thompson had transmitted from the basement, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching panic. The equations covering Sarah Chen's makeshift workshop weren't the desperate scrawlings of someone losing their sanity. They were advanced theoretical physics that made the Bureau's own research teams look like undergraduate students. This is impossible, Chief Researcher Dr. Michael Crawford said, adjusting his glasses as he studied the mathematical formulations on Webb's secure tablet. Crawford had spent 15 years analyzing anomalous subjects, published dozens of papers on quantum consciousness theory, and considered himself the foremost expert on reality-manipulating individuals in federal service. Thompson claims Chen has been conducting independent research into consciousness-mediated quantum field manipulation, Webb said, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose entire operational framework was being challenged. Research that apparently makes our containment protocols look primitive. Crawford shook his head dismissively. Director Chen is a construction engineer with no advanced physics training. These equations were probably copied from textbooks or internet sources. Thompson is either being deceived, or she's deliberately misrepresenting the situation for reasons of her own. And Thompson's credentials? Revoked for good reason, Crawford replied with the confidence of someone who'd never had his professional judgment questioned. The Prague incident, the Nevada facility disaster, unauthorized experimentation, conflicts with department heads. She's a brilliant theorist who proved incapable of working within proper scientific protocols. Webb looked back at the photographs, particularly focusing on equations that seemed to describe mathematical relationships he didn't recognize. Could Chen have developed this level of theoretical understanding independently? Absolutely not, Crawford said firmly. Quantum consciousness theory requires years of graduate-level study, access to advanced research materials, and collaboration with established physicists. A construction worker doesn't suddenly become capable of breakthrough theoretical work just because she survived an industrial accident. In the basement across the city, Thompson was helping Sarah organize 6 months of research into coherent theoretical frameworks that could be presented to skeptical federal scientists. They worked together with the easy collaboration of researchers who spoke the same mathematical language, building on each other's insights to develop ideas that neither could have reached alone. The consciousness integration appears to be triggered by extreme physical stress combined with exposure to quantum field fluctuations, Sarah explained, pointing to equations that described the exact conditions of her transformation. The construction site accident created a perfect storm of circumstances that forced my awareness to adapt or cease functioning entirely. Thompson nodded, adding her own notations to Sarah's work, which means the integration wasn't a random anomalous manifestation. It was consciousness evolution under survival pressure. Your brain literally rewired itself to process quantum information as a survival mechanism. But Crawford and his team will never accept that explanation, Sarah said, her expression showing the frustration of months spent trying to communicate with researchers who approached her as a subject rather than a colleague. They're convinced that anomalous abilities are violations of natural law rather than applications of natural law we don't understand yet. Thompson looked up from the equations with a slight smile. Sarah, what would you say to demonstrate the practical applications of your research in ways that even the most skeptical federal scientist couldn't dismiss? Above them, the sound of multiple vehicles arriving suggested that Webb had decided to escalate the situation rather than wait for Thompson's theoretical explanations. Sarah's expression immediately shifted to the hyper-alert awareness that had kept her alive through 6 months of containment attempts. They're bringing more equipment, she said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone whose consciousness was already calculating optimal defensive responses. Electromagnetic pulse generators, kinetic dampeners, probably some experimental restraint systems that Crawford's team thinks might work better than previous attempts. Thompson activated her radio, speaking with the patient tone of someone addressing particularly slow students. Director Webb, I strongly recommend that you do not attempt another containment operation while I'm in this building. Sarah's defensive responses are involuntary, mathematically precise, and calibrated to neutralize any perceived threat, with exactly enough force to ensure survival. Quote. Webb's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled frustration. Thompson, you've been in there for 2 hours without reporting your status. We need confirmation that Chen isn't manipulating you or holding you hostage. Webb, the only person being manipulated here is you, by your own assumptions about what you're dealing with, Thompson replied. Sarah Chen isn't a containment subject. She's a researcher who's made breakthrough discoveries that your team lacks the theoretical background to understand. Crawford's assessment indicates that Chen couldn't possibly have developed the level of theoretical understanding suggested by your reports. Thompson looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed amusement with anticipation. Sarah, would you like to have a direct conversation with Dr. Crawford about his assessment of your theoretical capabilities? Before Sarah could respond, the building's concrete walls began vibrating with the low-frequency hum of heavy machinery being positioned outside. Through basement windows, they could see lights from electromagnetic field generators being assembled in tactical formation around the building's perimeter. They're setting up a containment grid, Sarah said, her awareness automatically analyzing the equipment configuration and calculating probable field strength patterns. Electromagnetic pulse designed to disrupt neural function, kinetic dampening fields to prevent physical movement, and what appears to be an experimental consciousness suppression array. Thompson studied the equipment through the window with professional interest. Consciousness suppression? That's new. Crawford's latest theoretical development, Sarah explained, her voice showing the strain of involuntary defensive calculations beginning to engage. The theory is that anomalous abilities are enhanced by conscious awareness, so suppressing consciousness should eliminate anomalous manifestations, which would essentially put you in a coma while they attempt physical restraint. Right. Except the consciousness suppression field would also eliminate the voluntary control I've developed over my defensive responses. Instead of calculated, measured reactions, they'd be dealing with pure survival instinct with no conscious moderation. Thompson activated her radio again, her tone shifting from patient explanation to urgent warning. Webb, do not activate that consciousness suppression array. Sarah's control over her abilities depends on conscious awareness. Suppressing her consciousness will eliminate the voluntary restraint that's kept your teams alive through previous containment attempts. Crawford's models indicate that consciousness suppression should eliminate anomalous manifestations entirely, Webb replied. Crawford's models are wrong, Thompson said flatly. And if you test his theory, you're going to discover exactly how wrong, in ways that will make the previous incidents look like minor equipment malfunctions. Through the basement windows, they could see tactical teams taking positions around the building's perimeter. Unlike previous containment attempts that had focused on direct confrontation, this operation appeared designed to contain the entire structure and everyone inside it. They're treating this as a hostage situation, Sarah observed, her awareness tracking team movements with mathematical precision. Standard protocol when a federal agent fails to maintain communication during anomalous subject contact. Thompson pulled out her notebook and began sketching rapid calculations. Sarah, if they activate that consciousness suppression field while you're in defensive mode, what's your assessment of probable outcomes? Sarah closed her eyes and ran through scenarios with the computational speed that still amazed Thompson. The building collapsed within 90 seconds. Electromagnetic feedback that disables equipment within a 6-block radius. Kinetic shockwave that levels everything within the immediate blast area. Casualties? Unknown. My defensive calculations prioritize survival over casualty minimization when conscious control is eliminated. Thompson looked up from her notebook with an expression of someone who just realized the magnitude of the approaching crisis. Sarah, we need to demonstrate controlled application of your abilities before they force you into an uncontrolled response. What do you mean? Thompson was already pulling specialized equipment from her messenger bag. Not the simple tools she'd shown earlier, but precision instruments that revealed her true level of preparation for this encounter. Quantum field measurement devices, consciousness monitoring arrays, and what appeared to be a portable dimensional stability detector. We're going to conduct a real-time demonstration of consciousness-mediated quantum field manipulation under controlled conditions, Thompson said, assembling equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed similar experiments many times before. And we're going to broadcast the results directly to Webb's command post so Crawford can watch his theoretical models collapse in real time. Sarah stared at the equipment with growing understanding. You came prepared for this. Sarah, I've been researching consciousness quantum integration for 15 years. The Nevada incident, the Prague conference, the conflicts with federal research administrators. I've been developing practical applications of theoretical frameworks that people like Crawford still think are impossible. Thompson activated communication equipment that bypassed standard bureau channels, establishing direct contact with research facilities that Webb didn't know existed. Within minutes, she had 3 independent physics teams monitoring the basement through quantum field sensors that could measure consciousness interaction with matter at the subatomic level. Ladies and gentlemen, Thompson said, speaking to an audience of researchers in locations that Sarah couldn't identify, you're about to witness the first controlled demonstration of macro-scale consciousness-mediated quantum field manipulation by an integrated subject. Sarah felt a familiar surge of performance anxiety, mixed with professional excitement. For 6 months, she'd been working in isolation, developing theories and calculations without anyone to validate her work or appreciate her discoveries. Now she had an audience of people who might actually understand what she'd accomplished. Start with something simple, Thompson suggested. Demonstrate controlled matter manipulation at the molecular level. Sarah approached a section of concrete wall and placed her hand flat against the surface. Instead of the involuntary defensive responses that had characterized her previous encounters with federal agents, she consciously directed her awareness toward the molecular structure of the concrete itself. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The concrete began reshaping itself under her touch, not through applied force but through direct manipulation of molecular bonds. She created precise geometric patterns in the wall surface, demonstrating control that went beyond mere strength to actual matter restructuring at the atomic level. Fascinating, Thompson murmured, recording measurements on equipment that showed quantum field fluctuations correlating directly with Sarah's conscious intentions. Perfect control, no energy waste, no structural instability. You're not forcing matter to change, You're convincing it to change. Above them, the sounds of equipment preparation were growing more urgent as Crawford's team prepared to implement their consciousness suppression protocol. Through her radio, Thompson could hear heated arguments between Webb and Crawford about operational safety and theoretical validity. "The demonstration is impressive," Crawford's voice came through the radio with grudging acknowledgement, "but it doesn't change the fact that Chen represents an uncontained threat to public safety. Controlled abilities under laboratory conditions don't guarantee behavioral stability in real-world situations." Thompson looked at Sarah with a question in her eyes. Sarah nodded with grim determination. "Dr. Crawford," Thompson said into her radio, "Sarah would like to demonstrate the difference between controlled response and uncontrolled reaction. She's going to show you exactly what would happen if you eliminate her conscious control through your suppression field." "That's not advisable," Webb interjected, his voice showing awareness that the situation was escalating beyond his comfort level. "You're right," Thompson agreed. "It's not advisable. It's absolutely necessary, because Crawford's about to implement a protocol that will force exactly this type of response on a much larger scale." Sarah moved to the center of the basement and closed her eyes, allowing her consciousness to shift from controlled demonstration mode to pure defensive instinct. The change was immediate and terrifying. Every piece of metal in the basement began vibrating with harmonic frequencies that turned structural support beams into tuning forks. The concrete floor developed stress fractures that followed perfect mathematical curves radiating outward from Sarah's position. But most unsettling was the complete absence of conscious moderation. Sarah's awareness was still calculating optimal responses, but without voluntary control, those calculations prioritized absolute survival over any other consideration. The building itself became a weapon, its structure reshaping to create defensive advantages that made conventional tactical approaches impossible. "This is what happens when consciousness is suppressed while defensive instincts remain active," Thompson announced to her radio audience. "Complete elimination of voluntary restraint, mathematical optimization for survival without regard for collateral consequences, and escalation that continues until all perceived threats are neutralized." Sarah opened her eyes and immediately reasserted conscious control, causing the building's defensive transformations to reverse themselves with the same mathematical precision that had created them. The demonstration lasted less than 30 seconds, but its implications were unmistakable. "Crawford," Thompson said quietly, "your consciousness suppression field won't eliminate Sarah's abilities. It will eliminate the only thing that's been protecting your teams from the full application of those abilities." The radio silence that followed was the sound of theoretical assumptions colliding with practical reality, and reality winning decisively. The silence on the radio stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Webb's voice returned, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Thompson, I'm ordering an immediate stand-down of all containment protocols. I need you and Chen topside for an emergency briefing." Dr. Crawford's voice immediately cut through the radio channel with barely controlled indignation. "Director, we cannot abandon established containment procedures based on an unverified demonstration. Thompson's experimental approach violates every safety protocol we've developed for anomalous subject interaction." "Crawford," Webb replied, his tone shifting to the flat authority that ended arguments rather than encouraging them. "I just watched 30 seconds of video that makes your entire theoretical framework look like academic speculation. Stand down your equipment and prepare for full protocol review." Thompson looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed satisfaction with apprehension. "Ready to meet the people who've been trying to capture you for 6 months?" Sarah glanced around the basement workshop that had been her home, laboratory, and sanctuary since the containment attempts began. 6 months of equations, calculations, and theoretical breakthroughs that nobody had bothered to examine because they were too focused on treating her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. "What happens if they decide your approach doesn't work either?" Sarah asked, beginning to organize her research materials into transportable form. "Then we improvise," Thompson replied, packing her equipment with the efficient movements of someone who'd evacuated research sites under pressure before. "But I have a feeling that once Webb sees your actual research instead of Crawford's assumptions about your research, the conversation is going to change dramatically." They emerged from the basement to find the building's lobby filled with federal agents who looked like they'd been expecting a combat situation and instead found themselves dealing with what appeared to be an academic conference. Thompson walked past tactical equipment and armed personnel with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted the outcome. while Sarah followed with the cautious awareness of someone who'd learned not to trust authority figures carrying restraint devices. The command post had been transformed since Thompson's arrival. Banks of monitoring equipment now displayed real-time quantum field measurements, consciousness activity readings, and dimensional stability assessments that most of the tactical team couldn't interpret but found deeply unsettling. Webb stood at the center of it all, studying readouts that challenged everything he thought he knew about anomalous subject management. Dr. Crawford approached Sarah with the clinical detachment of someone examining a laboratory specimen, his expression showing the particular type of skepticism that came from years of academic certainty. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to discuss your alleged theoretical work with you directly." "Dr. Chen," Sarah corrected quietly. "I completed my doctorate in structural engineering 3 months before the construction site incident." Crawford's expression flickered with surprise, but he recovered quickly. "Even with doctoral-level engineering training, the mathematical frameworks Thompson claims you've developed require specialized knowledge in quantum mechanics, consciousness studies, and dimensional physics that wouldn't be covered in engineering curricula." Quote, Sarah set down her collection of research materials and pulled out a worn notebook that had clearly seen months of intensive use. "Dr. Crawford, before my consciousness integrated with quantum field mechanics, I had a basic understanding of physics as it applied to structural engineering. After the integration, I had direct experiential knowledge of how consciousness influences matter at the subatomic level." She opened the notebook to reveal pages of calculations that made Crawford's eyes widen despite his professional skepticism. The mathematics were elegant, innovative, and completely outside the boundaries of conventional physics education. "These equations describe consciousness as a measurable force that can influence quantum field behavior," Crawford said, his voice showing the strain of someone whose theoretical assumptions were being challenged by empirical evidence. "Because consciousness is a measurable force that influences quantum field behavior," Sarah replied with the patience of someone who'd been trying to explain this concept for months. "The construction site accident didn't give me superhuman abilities. It gave me direct conscious access to quantum processes that everyone experiences, but most people can't perceive or control." Thompson stepped forward, pulling out her own notebook filled with 15 years of theoretical research. "Crawford, what Sarah discovered through a traumatic accident, I've been approaching through controlled experimentation for over a decade. The integration of consciousness with quantum mechanics isn't an anomalous manifestation. It's evolution." Crawford studied both notebooks with the intense focus of someone whose entire professional framework was being reconstructed in real time. The mathematics were undeniable, the experimental data was consistent, and the theoretical implications were staggering. "If this research is accurate," Crawford said slowly, "then every approach we've taken to anomalous subject containment has been fundamentally flawed." "Not flawed," Thompson corrected. "Irrelevant. You've been trying to contain people who've evolved beyond the need for containment. They're not dangerous anomalies. They're the future of human consciousness development." Webb approached the group with a secure tablet showing classified files that he'd been reviewing while Thompson and Sarah were underground. "Dr. Thompson, I think it's time you explained exactly who you are and why your security clearance was revoked." Thompson looked around the command post, noting the mixture of tactical personnel, research scientists, and federal administrators who were all listening with varying degrees of comprehension and concern. "My name is Dr. Rebecca Thompson," she began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been keeping secrets for longer than she'd wanted to. "For 12 years, I was the lead researcher for Project Mindbridge, a classified program investigating consciousness-reality interface phenomena. My team's mission was to identify, study, and develop practical applications for individuals whose consciousness had evolved beyond conventional human limitations." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the electronic equipment seemed to quiet as Thompson continued her explanation. "The Nevada incident wasn't an experimental accident. It was a successful demonstration of consciousness-mediated dimensional stabilization that prevented a reality breach that would have affected millions of people. The Prague conference wasn't unauthorized experimentation. It was a desperate attempt to share research that could help people like Sarah understand and control their abilities." Crawford looked stunned. Project Mindbridge was theoretical research. There were no practical applications. "Because every practical application was classified beyond your clearance level," Thompson replied. "Crawford, you've been studying the theory of consciousness-reality interface for your entire career. I spent 12 years working with people who were living that interface every day. She pulled out her phone and began accessing files that required security clearances Webb hadn't seen since his early days in military intelligence. Project documentation that showed 12 years of successful consciousness integration cases, theoretical breakthroughs that revolutionized understanding of human potential, and practical applications that had been classified to prevent public panic. Sarah isn't the first person to experience consciousness quantum integration, Thompson continued. She's the 47th case I've documented. The difference is that she's the first one who's had to deal with it without proper support, guidance, or understanding from the people trying to help her. Webb studied the classified files with growing comprehension. You're saying there are 46 other people with abilities similar to Chen's? I'm saying there are 46 other people who've learned to consciously collaborate with quantum reality instead of being unconsciously controlled by it, Thompson corrected. People who've developed their abilities into tools for solving problems that conventional approaches can't address. Sarah looked at Thompson with an expression mixing hope and disbelief. Are there others like me? Not like you, Thompson said gently. Each consciousness integration is unique, shaped by individual personality, educational background, and the specific circumstances that triggered the evolution. But yes, there are others who understand what you've been going through. Crawford was reading through Project Mindbridge documentation with the fascination of someone discovering that his theoretical work had practical applications he'd never imagined. These case studies show successful integration and control development in every documented subject. Because we approach them as people experiencing evolution rather than problems requiring containment, Thompson explained, we provided education, support, and collaboration instead of restraints, suppression, and isolation. Webb looked up from the classified files with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering every decision he'd made regarding Sarah's case. Thompson, why didn't you present these credentials from the beginning? Because Project Mindbridge was shut down after political pressure from people who believed consciousness evolution represented a threat to established power structures, Thompson replied. My security clearance was revoked, my research funding was eliminated, and I was prohibited from discussing my work with anyone without proper clearance. She gestured towards Sarah, who was reading through Project Mindbridge case studies with growing excitement. But sometimes the mission is more important than the politics. When Amanda called me about Sarah's case, I knew I was looking at someone who needed help that only someone with Mindbridge experience could provide. Crawford approached Sarah with an expression that had transformed from clinical skepticism to genuine professional respect. Dr. Chen, would you be willing to collaborate with our research team on developing better support protocols for consciousness-integrated individuals? Sarah looked up from the case studies with surprise. You want me to work with you instead of being contained by you? I want to learn from you, Crawford corrected. Your research represents 6 months of intensive independent study into consciousness quantum mechanics by someone with direct experiential knowledge. That's more valuable than decades of theoretical speculation by people who've never experienced integration themselves. Webb stepped forward, his decision clearly made. Dr. Chen, I'm offering you a consulting position with the Bureau's Anomalous Research Division. Full clearance, research facilities, collaboration with the best consciousness researchers in federal service, and the opportunity to help other people who find themselves in situations similar to yours. Sarah looked at Thompson for guidance, still uncertain whether this represented genuine opportunity or sophisticated manipulation. It's legitimate, Thompson assured her. Webb's approach is exactly what Project Mindbridge was designed to accomplish. Support and development instead of containment and suppression. And Dr. Thompson, Sarah asked, what happened to her? Webb looked at Thompson with an expression that mixed apology with appreciation. Dr. Thompson's security clearance is hereby reinstated, with full authorization to resume consciousness integration research under Bureau auspices. Project Mindbridge is officially reactivated as of this moment. Crawford extended his hand to Thompson with the respect of one professional acknowledging another's superior expertise. Dr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. My theoretical understanding blinded me to practical realities that you've been working with for years. Thompson shook his hand with genuine warmth. Crawford, theoretical understanding provides the framework that makes practical application possible. We need both approaches working together. She turned to address the entire command post, speaking to tactical personnel, research scientists, and federal administrators, who were all trying to process the revelation that their most challenging containment case had just become their most valuable research asset. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed the future of human consciousness development. Sarah Chen isn't an anomaly to be contained. She's a pioneer who's shown us what becomes possible when consciousness evolves beyond conventional limitations. Quote, Sarah stood among people who were treating her as a colleague rather than a threat for the first time in 6 months, surrounded by research materials that represented breakthrough discoveries in consciousness studies, with the opportunity to help others who would face the same challenges she'd overcome. When do we start? She asked. Webb smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a problem that had been frustrating him for months. We start now. The Bureau's underground research facility hummed with activity that hadn't been seen since Project Mindbridge's original operations 12 years earlier. What had been repurposed as storage space for obsolete equipment was rapidly being converted back into the most advanced consciousness research laboratory in federal service. Sarah Chen stood in the center of it all, no longer the terrified fugitive hiding in abandoned buildings, but the focal point of a research effort that would reshape understanding of human potential. Dr. Thompson moved through the facility with the confident familiarity of someone returning home after a long absence. She directed equipment installation with precise knowledge of optimal configurations, recommended modifications to containment protocols that prioritized support over restriction, and began developing training curricula that would help other consciousness-integrated individuals avoid the months of isolation and fear that Sarah had endured. The key difference, Thompson explained to a mixed audience of researchers, federal administrators, and tactical personnel, is that we're not trying to suppress or control consciousness integration. We're trying to develop it into a collaborative partnership between enhanced awareness and quantum reality. Sarah approached a specially designed testing chamber that looked nothing like the restraint-focused containment cells she'd expected. Instead of barriers and suppression fields, the chamber contained measurement equipment, comfortable furniture, and what appeared to be collaborative workspace designed for extended research sessions. It's not a cage, she observed with something approaching wonder. It's a laboratory, Crawford corrected, his entire approach to anomalous subjects having been revolutionized by the previous day's revelations. A place where you can explore your abilities without worrying about property damage or safety concerns. Quote, Thompson activated monitoring equipment that began tracking quantum field fluctuations, consciousness activity patterns, and dimensional stability measurements with precision that made previous Bureau assessments look primitive. Sarah, I want you to demonstrate the controlled matter manipulation you showed me yesterday, but this time we're going to measure every aspect of the process. Sarah placed her hand against a specially prepared test surface made from composite materials designed to respond predictably to quantum field manipulation. Instead of the defensive reactions that had characterized her previous encounters with federal equipment, she consciously directed her awareness toward the molecular structure of the test material. The transformation was visible in real time through high-resolution microscopy. Molecular bonds reorganized themselves according to Sarah's conscious intention, creating precise geometric patterns that demonstrated not just control over matter, but understanding of the mathematical relationships governing atomic interaction. Fascinating, Dr. Elena Rodriguez murmured, joining the observation team after arriving from the Bureau's California facility. Rodriguez had spent 8 years studying consciousness-reality interface phenomena, but she'd never seen integration demonstrated with such precision and control. Thompson nodded toward the measurement displays showing quantum field activity that correlated perfectly with Sarah's conscious intentions. Sarah isn't applying force to change matters. She's communicating with quantum fields at the molecular level, essentially negotiating with reality to achieve desired outcomes. The implications are staggering, Crawford said, studying readouts that showed consciousness activity influencing physical matter through mechanisms that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and reality. If consciousness can directly influence quantum field behavior, then the boundary between observer and observed becomes meaningless. Sarah looked up from her demonstration with the slight smile of someone whose theoretical understanding was finally being validated by empirical measurement. That's exactly what I discovered during my months of independent research. Consciousness isn't separate from physical reality. It's an integral component of quantum mechanics that we've been ignoring because we couldn't measure it properly. Quote, Thompson pulled up Project Mindbridge case studies on the laboratory's main display showing documentation from 46 previous consciousness integration subjects. Each case follows similar patterns. Initial traumatic trigger that forces consciousness to adapt beyond conventional limitations. period of confusion and uncontrolled manifestation. Gradual development of conscious control through understanding and practice. But Sarah's case is unique, Rodriguez observed, studying the comparative data. Her level of theoretical understanding and independent research development far exceeds what we documented in previous subjects. Because Sarah is a trained engineer with doctoral-level education in structural systems, Thompson explained. When her consciousness integrated with quantum mechanics, she had the mathematical framework and analytical skills necessary to understand what was happening to her. Most previous subjects required months of education before they could begin developing conscious control. Sarah moved to another testing station designed to measure precision and control rather than raw capability. She began demonstrating increasingly complex matter manipulation techniques, each one accompanied by real-time explanation of the consciousness processes involved. The key insight, Sarah said, reshaping a metal alloy sample into intricate crystalline structures, is that consciousness and quantum fields operate according to mathematical relationships. Once you understand mathematics, you can develop conscious techniques for achieving specific outcomes. Crawford was recording every word with the fascination of someone whose theoretical framework was being validated and expanded simultaneously. Can these techniques be taught to others? That's what Project Mindbridge was designed to determine, Thompson replied, activating communication systems that connected the laboratory to research facilities in Nevada, California, and locations that Webb didn't recognize. We're going to conduct the first multi-site consciousness integration training program in over a decade. The main display activated to show faces of researchers and consciousness-integrated individuals from across the country. Dr. James Mitchell from the Nevada facility, Dr. Sarah Blackwood from California, and several people whose appearance suggested they'd experienced consciousness integration similar to Sarah's. Ladies and gentlemen, Thompson announced to the assembled group, meet Dr. Sarah Chen, our newest consciousness integration specialist, and the person who's going to help us revolutionize how we approach human consciousness development. Sarah looked at the faces on the screen, with emotions ranging from relief to excitement. For the first time in 6 months, she was looking at people who understood what she'd experienced, who'd faced similar challenges, and who'd learned to develop their abilities into tools for solving problems rather than sources of isolation and fear. Dr. Chen, Dr. Mitchell said from Nevada, we've been reviewing your theoretical work. Your mathematical frameworks for consciousness quantum interface are brilliant. Would you be interested in collaborating on developing practical applications for consciousness-mediated dimensional stabilization? Dimensional stabilization? Sarah asked, her engineering background immediately recognizing the significance of the application. Thompson smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose long-term planning was finally paying off. Sarah, remember how I mentioned that consciousness integration has practical applications beyond personal development? We're going to show you problems that only consciousness-integrated individuals can solve. She activated another display showing technical specifications for projects that required capabilities beyond conventional human limitations. Dimensional breach containment systems that needed conscious reality stabilization. Quantum computing arrays that required consciousness-mediated data processing. Advanced materials engineering that demanded direct molecular manipulation. These are applications that we developed during Project Mindbridge's original operations, Thompson explained. Technologies that remain theoretical for conventional approaches but become practical when consciousness-integrated individuals provide the interface between human intention and quantum reality. Sarah studied the project specifications with growing excitement. You're talking about engineering applications that use consciousness as a tool for controlling quantum processes. Engineering applications that only people like you can implement, Crawford confirmed. Your combination of structural engineering expertise and consciousness quantum integration makes you uniquely qualified for projects that require both technical knowledge and enhanced awareness. Dr. Rodriguez activated a demonstration that had been prepared specifically for Sarah's evaluation, a complex engineering problem involving structural stabilization under conditions that challenged conventional physics, materials that needed to maintain integrity while experiencing quantum field fluctuations that would normally cause immediate molecular breakdown. Conventional approaches have failed repeatedly, Rodriguez explained. The quantum field effects make normal structural engineering impossible, but consciousness-mediated stabilization might provide a solution. Sarah approached the demonstration setup with the focused intensity of an engineer examining a challenging technical problem. She studied the specifications, ran through mathematical calculations, and began developing an approach that combined her structural engineering knowledge with her consciousness quantum abilities. "The problem isn't the quantum field effects," she said after several minutes of analysis. "The problem is that conventional approaches try to resist the quantum fluctuations instead of working with them." She placed her hands on the test materials and began demonstrating techniques that Thompson had never seen before. Instead of imposing stability through force, Sarah was negotiating with quantum fields to achieve structural stability through conscious collaboration with reality itself. The results were immediately apparent. Materials that had been failing under quantum field stress began maintaining integrity while actually becoming stronger and more flexible. Sarah had solved an engineering problem that had been frustrating federal researchers for years, using techniques that combined traditional structural analysis with consciousness-mediated quantum field manipulation. "Remarkable," Mitchell said from Nevada. "Sarah, you've just demonstrated applications that our team has been trying to develop for 3 years." Thompson looked around the laboratory with satisfaction. Equipment that had been designed for containment and suppression was now being used for collaboration and development. Personnel who'd approached Sarah as a dangerous subject were now treating her as a valuable colleague. And most importantly, Sarah had transformed from an isolated, frightened fugitive into a confident researcher who understood her abilities and their potential applications. "Sarah," Thompson said, "I want you to design a training program for consciousness-integrated individuals who don't have your engineering background. Help them develop the theoretical understanding and practical skills necessary to gain conscious control over their abilities." Sarah looked at the assembled researchers, the advanced equipment, and the Project Mindbridge documentation that represented years of work with people who'd faced challenges similar to hers. For the first time since the construction site accident, she felt like she had a purpose that went beyond simple survival. "When do we start?" she asked. "We start now," Thompson replied, activating systems that would support the most comprehensive consciousness development program in federal history. "And Sarah, this is just the beginning. Once we've established protocols for consciousness integration support, we're going to begin identifying and helping other people who are experiencing similar evolution." Crawford pulled up statistical models showing projected rates of consciousness integration events over the next decade. "Based on Project Mindbridge data, we estimate that consciousness evolution cases will increase exponentially as more people experience the specific conditions that trigger integration." "Which means," Webb added, approaching the group with authorization documents that would formalize Sarah's position with the Bureau, "that Sarah's work here will help hundreds of people avoid the months of isolation and fear that she experienced." Sarah accepted the documents with hands that no longer shook with uncertainty. She was no longer a problem to be solved or a threat to be contained. She was a pioneer whose experiences would help others navigate similar transformations with support, understanding, and guidance instead of fear and containment attempts. "Dr. Chen," Thompson said formally, "welcome to Project Mindbridge." 6 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen walked across the campus of the Bureau's newly expanded Consciousness Development Institute with the confident stride of someone who'd found her true calling. The abandoned industrial complex in rural Virginia had been transformed into the most advanced facility for consciousness-integrated research in the world. Where once stood empty warehouses and rusted equipment, now gleamed laboratories, residential complexes, and training centers designed specifically for people whose awareness had evolved beyond conventional human limitations. Sarah carried a tablet displaying the morning schedule, 3 individual consultation sessions with newly integrated subjects, a collaborative research meeting with the MIT Quantum Consciousness team, and the weekly video conference with consciousness-integrated individuals worldwide. It was the kind of busy, purposeful day that she'd never imagined possible during those months of hiding in abandoned buildings, trying to understand what had happened to her. The first consultation was with Marcus Webb, not Director Webb, but a 19-year-old college student whose consciousness had integrated during a car accident 3 weeks earlier. He sat in Sarah's office with the same expression of confused terror that she remembered from her own early days, struggling to understand abilities that seemed to violate everything he'd learned about how the world worked. "The doctor said I was dead for 7 minutes," Marcus explained, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone whose reality had been fundamentally altered. "When I woke up, I could feel the molecular structure of everything around me, the hospital bed, the walls, even the air itself. And when I tried to move, things started changing." Sarah nodded with the understanding that came from personal experience. The integration process often occurs during traumatic events that push consciousness beyond its normal operating parameters. Your awareness adapted to survive conditions that would have been fatal under normal circumstances. She pulled out a notebook filled with exercises and techniques that she'd developed based on her own experience and months of working with similar cases. The important thing to understand is that you're not broken or dangerous. Your consciousness has simply developed capabilities that most people don't possess. With proper guidance and practice, you can learn to control these abilities instead of being controlled by them. Marcus looked at the exercises with the desperation of someone who'd been struggling alone with changes he couldn't understand. Will I ever be normal again? You'll be better than normal, Sarah replied gently. You'll be conscious in ways that most people never experience. It's challenging, but it's also extraordinary. Quote, after the consultation, Sarah walked to the Institute's main research laboratory, where Dr. Thompson was leading a collaborative session with consciousness-integrated individuals from facilities in California, Nevada, Colorado, and international locations that represented the growing global network of consciousness development centers. Sarah, Thompson called out as she entered, perfect timing. We're discussing the dimensional stabilization project for the European facility. They're dealing with reality fluctuations that require consciousness-mediated intervention. The main displays showed Dr. Henrik Larsson from the Stockholm facility, where consciousness-integrated researchers were working on problems that challenged the boundaries between science fiction and scientific reality. Behind him, Sarah could see equipment that looked like something from advanced physics laboratories, operated by people whose enhanced awareness made them capable of applications that conventional science couldn't achieve. Dr. Chen, Larsson said, we've been implementing the consciousness quantum interface protocols you developed. The results are remarkable. Our team has successfully stabilized dimensional fluctuations that were threatening to create reality breaches across Northern Europe. Sarah felt the familiar surge of professional satisfaction that came from seeing her theoretical work applied to solve real-world problems. What modifications did you need to make for the specific field conditions? Your mathematical frameworks were adaptable to local quantum field variations with minimal adjustment, Larsson replied. The key insight was treating consciousness as a collaborative partner with quantum mechanics, rather than an external observer trying to control quantum processes. Dr. Crawford entered the laboratory carrying files that represented the Institute's expanding mission beyond individual consciousness development. Sarah, we've received requests for consultation from NASA, CERN, and 3 international research organizations. Your reputation in consciousness-mediated engineering applications is spreading throughout the scientific community. Sarah looked at the consultation request with amazement. A year ago, she'd been hiding in basements, terrified of her own abilities, and convinced that she was a danger to everyone around her. Now she was being sought out by the world's most advanced research institutions for expertise that existed nowhere else. The NASA project is particularly interesting, Crawford continued. They're dealing with materials engineering challenges for deep space exploration that require molecular manipulation under conditions that exceed conventional technological capabilities. Your consciousness quantum integration techniques might provide solutions that pure technology cannot achieve. Thompson approached with a satisfied expression that showed how far the program had progressed beyond its original goals. Sarah, do you remember what I told you about consciousness integration being evolution rather than anomaly? That consciousness development represents the future of human capability rather than dangerous deviation from normal function, Sarah replied. Look around, Thompson gestured to the laboratory filled with advanced equipment, international collaborations, and researchers whose enhanced awareness was being applied to solve problems that had seemed impossible through conventional approaches. This is what the future looks like when consciousness evolution is supported rather than suppressed. Sarah walked to the window overlooking the Institute's residential area, where dozens of consciousness-integrated individuals lived, worked, and continued developing their abilities in an environment designed for support rather than containment. People who might have spent months or years hiding from authorities who couldn't understand them were instead contributing to scientific breakthroughs that benefited everyone. Dr. Chen, a voice called from the laboratory entrance. Sarah turned to see Agent Martinez, the same federal agent who'd been skeptical of Thompson's unconventional approach during those first tense days in Philadelphia. Now he served as liaison between the Institute and federal agencies that had learned to appreciate consciousness-integrated capabilities rather than fear them. Agent Martinez, Sarah replied with genuine warmth. How's the training program progressing? Better than anyone expected, Martinez said, carrying documentation that showed how federal response protocols had been revolutionized by understanding consciousness integration as evolution rather than anomaly. We've had 0 containment failures since implementing Thompson's assessment and support protocols. Every consciousness-integrated individual we've encountered has been successfully integrated into appropriate research or service positions. Quote, he handed Sarah a report showing statistics that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. 0 casualties from consciousness integration incidents. 100% success rate in developing conscious control over enhanced abilities. And most remarkably, consciousness-integrated individuals were proving to be valuable contributors to fields ranging from advanced materials research to dimensional physics. There's something else, Martinez continued, his expression shifting to something approaching reverence. The Philadelphia site where your integration began. The construction company has reported anomalous improvements in structural integrity throughout the entire building complex. Materials that should have degraded over time are actually becoming stronger and more stable. Sarah looked puzzled. I haven't been near that site in over a year. Thompson approached with interest. Sarah, quantum field integration doesn't just affect the individual who experiences it. Enhanced consciousness can create lasting positive influences on the quantum fields in areas where integration occurred. You're saying the construction site is permanently improved because of what happened to me there. I'm saying that consciousness evolution benefits not just the individual who experiences it, but the entire environment where that evolution takes place, Thompson explained. Your integration didn't just change you. It left a permanent positive influence on the quantum field structure of that location. Sarah felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond personal achievement to understanding her place in a larger pattern of human development. The traumatic accident that had seemed like the end of her normal life had actually been the beginning of capabilities that were helping people worldwide solve problems that conventional approaches couldn't address. Dr. Rodriguez entered the laboratory with a tablet showing the Institute's latest expansion plans. Sarah, we're opening consciousness development centers in 12 countries over the next 2 years. Each facility will implement the support protocols you've developed, ensuring that consciousness-integrated individuals receive guidance and education instead of fear and containment. And each center will be staffed partially by consciousness-integrated individuals who can provide the kind of understanding and support that only comes from personal experience, Thompson added. Sarah looked around the laboratory one more time, taking in the advanced equipment, international collaborations, and sense of purpose that pervaded everything the Institute accomplished. A year ago, she'd been convinced that her consciousness integration made her a danger to society. Now she understood that people like her represented humanity's next step in evolutionary development. I have an appointment, Sarah said, gathering her materials and heading toward the door. Research meeting? Crawford asked. Personal visit, Sarah replied. There's someone I need to thank. An hour later, Sarah stood in the lobby of a small structural engineering firm in downtown Philadelphia. The company had expanded significantly over the past year, taking on projects that required innovative approaches to materials engineering and structural dynamics. The success was largely due to consultation from someone whose understanding of structural mechanics had been enhanced beyond conventional limitations. Sarah, called out Jennifer Walsh, the firm's senior partner, approaching with the warm smile of someone whose business had been transformed by unexpected expertise. How did the NASA consultation go? They're implementing consciousness-mediated materials engineering for their Mars habitat project, Sarah replied. Turns out that some engineering challenges require awareness that can directly interface with molecular structure. Jennifer nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose decision to maintain Sarah on retainer had proved remarkably profitable. Any regrets about leaving traditional engineering for consciousness development research? Sarah looked out the window toward the construction site where her transformation had begun. The building complex had become something of a local landmark, not for its architectural significance, but for its inexplicable structural improvements that had attracted attention from engineering firms worldwide. Jennifer, I didn't leave traditional engineering, Sarah said with quiet confidence. I discovered what engineering becomes when consciousness evolves beyond conventional limitations. As she left the firm and walked toward her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Thompson. New consciousness integration case in Seattle. 24-year-old architect. Similar circumstances to your original incident. Available for consultation? Sarah typed back, on my way. Quote, She drove toward the airport with the radio playing classical music and a sense of purpose that extended far beyond personal fulfillment. Somewhere in Seattle, a person was experiencing the same confusion and fear that she'd felt during those first terrifying weeks after her integration. But unlike her experience, they wouldn't have to face the transformation alone. They would have guidance, support, and the knowledge that consciousness evolution was not a curse to be contained, but a gift to be developed. They would learn that enhanced awareness was not a source of isolation, but a pathway to contributions that could benefit everyone. Sarah Chen had become more than a survivor of consciousness integration. She had become a guide for others following the same extraordinary path, helping them transform what seemed like catastrophic change into purposeful evolution. Behind her, the Philadelphia skyline reflected the setting sun, while ahead lay another person whose consciousness had expanded beyond conventional limitations, waiting for someone who understood that some changes, no matter how frightening they initially appear, represent humanity's greatest opportunities for growth. The future of human consciousness development was no longer theoretical. It was practical, supported, and guided by people who'd learned that evolution, properly understood, was always a step forward rather than a deviation from the path. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.